When I married Harper, I thought I was walking into a fairy tale. She was everything I ever wanted: smart, beautiful, and full of life. But what I didn't realize back then was that I wasn't just marrying her. I was marrying her entire family. And that's where the nightmare began. Marcus, her father, was the king of their little empire, a towering man with a presence that commanded respect. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, told me from the very beginning that I wasn't welcome. I remember our first handshake vividly. His grip was firm, almost crushing, as if he was silently warning me to know my place. And I did. I stayed quiet, polite, eager to prove that I was good enough for his daughter. But with every passing year, I realized that no matter how much I tried, I was just an outsider in their perfect little world. Harper's family lived in a luxurious mansion in the suburbs of Boston, where everything smelled like wealth and power. The kind of place where secrets were whispered behind closed doors, and appearances mattered more than truth. Dinners at the house were like staged performances. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his word law, while Harper's brother Brandon and her sister Sophia echoed his opinions like loyal soldiers. I was always at the far end of the table, silent, invisible, a prop they tolerated because Harper loved me, or at least I thought she did. For 6 years, I played the perfect husband. I brought wine to family gatherings, helped clean up after dinners, and even learned to stomach Marcus's condescending remarks. I told myself it was just a phase, that they would eventually accept me. But deep down, I knew Marcus had no intention of letting me be part of their family. I was merely a placeholder, someone to fill a role while he maintained control over Harper's life. Harper, she used to be different, or maybe I was just too blinded by love to see it. Over time, she became quieter around me, more obedient to her father's wishes. It was as if Marcus had slowly drained the warmth out of her, replacing it with silent compliance. And I became a ghost in my own marriage, smiling through the pain and pretending everything was fine. But I was always watching, listening, taking mental notes. They thought I was weak, that I wouldn't fight back. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They say the worst kind of loneliness is being surrounded by people who make you feel invisible. I didn't understand that until I became part of Harper's world. At first, I thought it was just me overthinking things. Maybe I was being too sensitive, reading too much into their cold stares and empty conversations. But over the years, it became painfully clear. I wasn't imagining it. The signs were everywhere. Family group chats? I was never added. Weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard? The first only found out after seeing pictures on Harper's Instagram. Birthday parties for Marcus's friends? I wasn't invited, but Harper always had a good excuse ready. The worst part? Harper never stood up for me. She would brush it off with a laugh, saying, "They just need time to warm up to you, Evan." But 6 years is a long time for people to warm up, and I was tired of standing in the cold. Then came the little moments that stung the most. Thanksgiving dinners where I was the one clearing the plates, while Harper and her siblings sipped wine and talked about their family vacations. Or Christmas mornings when I'd wake up to see Harper opening gifts from her family while I sat there, pretending I didn't notice the absence of a gift with my name on it. But the moment that broke me, it was last year. Harper had invited me to one of Marcus's exclusive charity galas. I thought, finally, a chance to show him that I belonged. I spent weeks preparing new suit, polished shoes, everything perfect. But when we arrived, Marcus barely acknowledged me. "Evan," he said, with that fake smile plastered on his face. "I see you're still here." That was it. That's all I got. I stood there, smiling like an idiot while he introduced Harper to CEOs, politicians, and anyone he deemed important enough to acknowledge. And me? I was just a shadow trailing behind her. But that night, something changed. I stopped trying. I stopped hoping that they would see me as more than Harper's husband. I realized that no matter what I did, Marcus would always see me as a nuisance, someone who didn't belong in his world. So I did what I do best. I observed, I listened, and I started noticing things. Marcus was meticulous about his company's reputation, but I spotted cracks in his perfect image. Overheard whispers about irregularities in the company's finances, mentions of questionable investments, and unreported revenue. Harper's brother Brandon was too arrogant to hide his loose lips after a few drinks, and Sophia, bless her heart, was too naive to keep family secrets. I began piecing things together. Late-night conversations, briefcases full of documents. Marcus thought no one noticed, and those sudden business trips that didn't quite add up. I kept quiet, but I was taking mental notes. If Marcus was going to treat me like an outsider, I would play the part. But this outsider, he was preparing for a storm that no one saw coming. Christmas at the Lancaster mansion was always a grand affair. Everything about it screamed wealth, champagne flowing like water. A 12-foot tree decorated with imported glass ornaments, and a dining table set with silverware so polished I could see my reflection in it. For 6 years, I had endured this spectacle, sitting at the far end of the table, sipping expensive wine I had no taste for, and forcing a smile while Harper's family barely acknowledged my existence. But this year was different. I didn't walk into that house as the same man they had spent years belittling. No, this year, I was a man with a plan. I had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, consulting with financial experts, and building a case so airtight that even Marcus wouldn't be able to wiggle out of it. But I kept that part hidden behind the same polite smile I had worn for years. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey when we walked in. Martha, Harper's mother, greeted us with a forced smile that barely reached her eyes. Marcus, as usual, barely looked up from his glass of scotch, offering me a nod that felt more like a dismissal than a greeting. "Evan," Marcus drawled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Still hanging around, I see." I bit my tongue and smiled. "Good to see you too, Marcus." Harper gave me a look, the kind that said, "Just play nice," and I did. I played my part like a seasoned actor, blending into the background while the real show unfolded. Candles flickered softly on the dining table as everyone gathered around, laughter echoing through the marble-floored dining room. Dinner went exactly as I expected. Harper's brother, Brandon, boasted about his latest investment in some tech startup. Sophia rambled on about her upcoming yoga retreat in Bali. And Marcus? He sat at the head of the table, soaking in the admiration, like a king presiding over his court. I kept my head down, sipping my wine, and pretending not to notice the sideways glances and whispered jokes at my expense. Then came the moment that changed everything. "Before we get to dessert," Marcus announced, his voice commanding the room's attention, "I have a little surprise." He reached beneath his chair and pulled out a stack of glossy red gift bags. Each bag had a name carefully printed on it. Brandon, Sophia, Harper, and that was it. I knew before I even checked. My name wasn't there. "For all of you," Marcus said, handing out the bags one by one, a satisfied smirk plastered on his face. Brandon pulled out a set of keys. "A Porsche? Seriously, Dad?" Sophia gasped as she unwrapped a designer handbag that probably cost more than my entire annual salary. Harper received diamond earrings that sparkled under the chandelier lights. And me? I sat there, my fingers tightening around the stem of my wine glass, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. "Oh, Evan," Marcus said, feigning surprise as he looked around the table. "Did I forget you?" His smile was pure malice. The room fell silent. I felt their eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd react. Harper's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flickering with something that looked suspiciously like guilt, but she said nothing. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. "It's okay," I said softly, setting my glass down with calculated calm. "I didn't forget me." For a moment, the room stayed frozen, as if time itself had paused to witness what was coming next. I reached beneath the table and pulled out a small, perfectly wrapped gift box tied with a crimson ribbon. The kind of box that looked like it held something delicate, something precious. I stood up, all eyes on me, and walked around the table until I was standing right beside Marcus. "This," I said, placing the box in front of him, "is for you." Marcus's smile faltered for the first time. "Evan," he chuckled, trying to mask the sudden tension in the room. "You shouldn't have." "Oh," I murmured, leaning slightly closer so only he could hear me, "but I really should have." He untied the ribbon, his fingers moving slower than usual. His confidence, that cocky arrogance he wore like a second skin, began to peel away as he opened the box. Inside was a neatly stacked pile of documents, financial reports, tax records, and a detailed summary of every illegal transaction Marcus had tried to hide. Marcus's face paled as he skimmed through the pages, his his hand starting to tremble. What the hell is this?" he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "Proof," I said quietly, my voice steady as steel. "Proof that you've been embezzling funds from your company and falsifying tax reports. Proof that you've been lying to your family for years." The color drained from his face. "I've been watching, Marcus," I continued, my tone calm but laced with a quiet power. "For years. I noticed the discrepancies. I followed the money. I hired forensic accountants. And now," I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Now, I have everything I need to make sure the IRS and the authorities know exactly what you've been up to." Silence. Dead. Absolute silence. Sophia's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. Brandon blinked, looking from Marcus to the papers like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Harper. She didn't say a word. Her face was pale, her lips pressed so tight they were almost colorless. "Evan," Marcus's voice cracked, but I didn't let him finish. "Merry Christmas, Marcus," the first said softly, stepping back and watching as the weight of the truth settled on his shoulders like a crushing boulder. And for the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel small. For the first time, I had all the power. The silence that followed was the kind that pressed down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper as Marcus flipped through the documents, his hands shaking more with each passing page. I stood there, watching him unravel, feeling the weight of 6 years of humiliation, neglect, and quiet suffering finally lift from my shoulders. "Evan." Marcus's voice barely rose above a whisper, but it was laced with panic. His eyes, usually so cold and calculating, were wide with disbelief. For the first time, the great Marcus Lancaster looked afraid. What is this?" he croaked, his fingers gripping the edge of the stack as if he could somehow make the evidence disappear by holding it tighter. "You know exactly what it is," I said, my voice steady, my expression unreadable. "Detailed financial records, transaction logs, offshore account movements. All the evidence the IRS would need to investigate you for tax fraud and embezzlement." The blood drained from his face, leaving him as pale as the linen tablecloth. "You've been," he glanced up at me, his voice trembling, "spying on me?" I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Spying?" I echoed, shaking my head. "No, Marcus. I was paying attention, something you never bothered to do when it came to me." I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough so that everyone had to strain to hear. "You thought I was weak," I murmured, my gaze locking onto his. "You thought I was some powerless outsider, just tagging along in Harper's life. But while you were too busy looking down on me, I was watching, learning, preparing." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Harper, who sat frozen, her face as pale as her father's. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I saw the panic in her eyes, the realization that everything was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Evan," Harper finally whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Why would you do this?" I turned to her, my expression softer but no less resolute. "Why?" I repeated quietly. "Because I spent 6 years trying to be part of this family. I bent over backwards to fit into a world that never wanted me, and all I got in return was disrespect, indifference, and silence." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't waver. "You let them humiliate me, Harper, over and over again." My voice grew firmer, the weight of my words filling the room. "And you stood by and did nothing." Harper's lower lip quivered, but she said nothing, because she knew I was right. "But I didn't do this out of spite," I continued, turning back to Marcus, who was still gripping the documents as if they might disappear. "I did this because someone had to stop you. This is a mistake," Marcus stammered, his bravado cracking under the weight of reality. "You don't know what you're doing, Evan. These are just misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms. "Is that what you call funneling company funds into offshore accounts? Or claiming non-existent business expenses to avoid taxes? Because the IRS..." I tapped the stack of papers with one finger. "They'll call it something else." "Evan," Martha's voice broke the tension. She had been silent this whole time, sitting at the end of the table with wide, teary eyes. Is this true?" Marcus's head snapped toward his wife, his face twisted with panic. "Martha, it's not what you think. Is it true?" she repeated, her voice louder this time, cutting through the chaos. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was damning enough. "Oh my God." Martha's voice trembled as she pushed back her chair, standing up with shaky legs. You told me we were fine, that everything was under control. Marcus, how could you? Martha, please. Marcus reached for her, but she pulled away, her eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. Sophia, who had been unusually quiet, picked up one of the pages and skimmed through it. Her eyes widened, her hands trembling as she read the damning evidence. Dad, her voice was barely a whisper. You told me. You said you couldn't help when I needed money for the surgery. Brandon snatched the papers from her, his face darkening as he pieced together the truth. All those times, he muttered, shaking his head. You said we had to be careful with spending. You made Mom cut back on everything. And all this time, Marcus's carefully curated empire was crumbling right in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Evan, Marcus's voice was low, desperate. You don't have to do this. We can fix this. I'll make it right. Make it right? I tilted my head, giving him a look of disbelief. You had years to make it right, Marcus, but instead, you chose to lie, manipulate, and treat everyone around you like pawns in your little game. I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough so that only he could hear. And now, I whispered, my lips curling into a cold smile. Now, it's checkmate. Marcus's breath hitched, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his downfall finally hit him. I've already sent copies of these documents to the IRS, I said, stepping back and letting my words settle over the room like a storm cloud. By this time next week, they'll be launching a full investigation, and once they do, I glanced around the table, my gaze lingering on Harper before returning to Marcus. Your little empire will come crashing down. Marcus's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, because he knew it was over. I didn't do this to hurt you, Marcus, the first said, my voice quieter now, but no less powerful. I did this to finally set myself free. The weight that had been crushing me for years lifted. For the first time, I felt truly free. Merry Christmas, I murmured, stepping away from the table, to all of you. As I turned to leave, I could feel their eyes on me, Harper's, filled with regret, Martha's, filled with pain, and Marcus's, filled with a fear he had never known before. But I didn't look back, because I wasn't that quiet, invisible man anymore. I was walking away, on my own terms. I didn't look back when I walked out of the Lancaster mansion that night. The cold December air hit my face like a splash of ice water. But for the first time in 6 years, I could breathe. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest, suffocating me in silence, was finally gone. I stood on the porch for a moment, watching the snowflakes drift lazily down, coating the perfectly manicured lawn. Behind me, the house was eerily quiet. No more laughter, no more clinking glasses or whispered conversations. Just the heavy silence of a family that had been torn apart by the truth. Evan, I didn't need to turn around to know it was Harper. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the cold like a knife. Please, she said, her footsteps crunching on the snow as she approached. Don't go like this. I finally turned, and there she was standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, as if the cold was finally getting to her. But I knew the chill she felt had nothing to do with the weather. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips trembling, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Like this? I echoed, my voice calm but distant. How else should I go, Harper? Should I wait for your father to recover from his humiliation? Or maybe stick around until he finds a way to sweep everything under the rug again? Her face crumpled, her eyes pleading. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know he was doing all of that. Didn't you? I asked softly, tilting my head. Or did you just choose not to see it? Harper blinked, her gaze dropping to the ground. I saw it the flicker of doubt, the realization that somewhere deep down, she had known. Maybe not all the details, but enough to know that Marcus was not the perfect man he pretended to be. I tried, Evan, she murmured, her voice cracking. I tried to protect you from all of this. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Protect me? I repeated, the words tasting sour on my tongue. Harper, you stood by and watched them tear me down. Every time Marcus humiliated me, every time Brandon made snide remarks, every time Sophia looked at me like I didn't belong, you said nothing. You let them treat me like I was invisible. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. You didn't protect me, I said quietly, my voice softer now but no less firm. You protected them. You chose them over me. Every single time. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. And in that moment, I realized there was nothing left to say. I waited for 6 years, Harper, I continued, my voice barely above a whisper now. I waited it for you to choose me, but you never did. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my wedding ring. The platinum band felt heavier than it ever had before, as if it carried the weight of all the years I had spent waiting for something that was never going to happen. I'm done waiting, I murmured, gently placing the ring in her hand. Her fingers closed around it, and a single tear slid down her cheek. Evan. Her voice broke, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned and walked away, my footsteps crunching softly against the snow-covered driveway. Each step felt lighter, like I was shedding the weight of the past with every stride. The collapse of the Lancaster Empire. It didn't take long for the news to break. The next morning, headlines splashed across financial websites and local news outlets. Lancaster Enterprises under investigation for tax fraud and embezzlement. The IRS didn't waste any time. The investigation was swift, brutal, and unforgiving. Marcus's carefully constructed empire crumbled like a house of cards. His business accounts were frozen, his properties seized, and his reputation gone. Martha filed for divorce within a week. I wasn't surprised. She had been living in the shadows of Marcus's lies for too long. She deserved better. Sophia moved back to California, wanting to escape the chaos and rebuild her life far away from her family's disgrace. Brandon, well, he tried to play the victim, claiming he had no idea what his father was up to. But no one believed him. He had been too close to Marcus for too long to claim ignorance. As for Harper, I heard she moved into a smaller apartment in the city. She stayed out of the spotlight, avoiding the media frenzy that followed her family's downfall. We didn't speak after that night. I didn't block her number. I didn't need to. She never called, and I never looked back. Starting over, on my own terms, I rented a small place downtown, a cozy apartment with a view of the city skyline. It wasn't a mansion in the suburbs, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt free. I threw myself into my work, taking on clients who appreciated what I had to offer. It was fulfilling, knowing that I was building something for myself without anyone looking over my shoulder, judging me, or trying to control me. I made new friends, real friends, people who didn't care about wealth or status. And I discovered something I had forgotten somewhere along the way. I was enough. I didn't need to prove my worth to anyone. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. I wasn't the man who had walked into the Lancaster mansion 6 years ago. That man had been eager to please, desperate to belong. The man standing here now, he didn't need anyone's approval. A final goodbye. A few months later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Harper. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a short note, written in her elegant, flowing script. Evan, I'm sorry for everything. I wish I had been braver. I wish I had chosen you, but I understand now that sometimes love isn't enough when you don't have the courage to fight for it. You deserved better. Harper. I folded the note and set it aside. There was no anger, no bitterness left in me, just closure, because I had already moved on. Walking away wasn't losing, it was winning. As I stood there, breathing in the cool night air, I realized something. Walking away didn't mean I had lost. It meant I had finally won. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't destroying someone's life. It's rebuilding your own. Story 2. My name's Jake, and I've been working at this little sandwich shop in downtown Chicago for the last 3 years. It's one of those places where the lunch rush hits like a tidal wave. Construction workers, tourists, business folks in suits, all crammed into a space barely big enough to breathe. I know the drill by now. Keep the line moving, stay polite no matter what, and don't let the chaos get to you. But no amount of experience could have prepared me for him. It was a Thursday, right around noon, and we were slammed. I was on the register, ringing up an older woman who had been waiting patiently. She was probably in her late 60s, with that gentle smile that reminded me of my grandma. I had just finished asking if she wanted chips when he walked in. Tall, probably mid-40s, dressed in a suit that screamed money. His watch caught the light just enough to make sure everyone noticed it, and he carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my rent. The way he moved like the world was his personal playground set off alarm bells before he even opened his mouth. I barely had time to process his presence before he strolled right past the 20 or so people in line and parked himself at the counter. No glance at the line, No hesitation, just straight to the front like he owned the place. "Sir," one said, trying to stay polite, "the line starts back there." He didn't even look at me, just waved his hand dismissively, pulling out a sleek black Amex and tapping it on the counter. "Ring me up." I swear the air got sucked out of the room. Conversation stopped. Even my coworker, slicing bread behind me, froze mid-motion. The older woman I was helping raised an eyebrow, her smile gone. "Sir," one repeated, keeping my tone steady but firm. "I help customers in the order they arrive. You'll need to wait your turn." Finally, he looked at me, and that's when it happened. He smirked. Not just any smirk, a smug one, the kind that made my stomach twist. Then, he leaned in just enough, so only I could hear. "I make more money in an hour than you do in a month," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. My jaw clenched. I've dealt with rude customers before, but this was something else. His words weren't just rude, they were meant to make me feel small. Like I was nothing, like I didn't matter. The shop was dead silent now. I could feel the eyes of every customer on me, waiting to see what I'd do. I took a deep breath, forcing a calm. I didn't really feel. "Sir," one said, louder this time so everyone could hear, "if you make that much money, then surely you understand the concept of waiting your turn. Just like everybody else." His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure irritation. He scoffed, shaking his head, still acting like I was beneath him. "Fine," he said, voice dripping with fake patience. "Then I'll just take your job instead." I blinked. For a second, I thought I misheard. Did this man just threaten to take my job because I wouldn't let him cut the line? Something in me snapped. Without breaking eye contact, I reached under the counter, grabbed a blank job application, and slid it across to him. "Go ahead," I said, folding my arms. "Let's see if you qualify." For a moment, the entire world stood still. His face went bright red, the smirk twitching like he was trying to hold onto whatever power he thought he had left. But he could feel it slipping. I could see it. The older woman beside him, she let out a low chuckle, crossing her arms and giving him a look that screamed. "Bless your heart, is that all?" I asked, keeping my tone cool, calm, and collected. He didn't answer. He just grabbed the application, crumpling it in his hand like it personally offended him. "This is a joke," he muttered, but I shrugged. "You said you wanted my job." The crowd was eating it up. A few people snickered, and I caught one of my coworkers turning away to hide a grin. But Mr. Rolex wasn't done yet. "Oh no." He pulled out his phone. "All right," he muttered, scrolling through his contacts. "Let's see who really runs this place." My stomach dropped. At first, I thought he was bluffing, but then he hit a name and lifted the phone to his ear. A deep, business-like voice answered. "Yeah," Mr. Rolex said, his smirk making an unwelcome return. "Mike, I'm at that sandwich shop on 5th. Your company does their insurance, right?" My heart pounded in my ears. My coworker's smile disappeared. I heard someone in line whisper, "Oh, this guy's serious." Mr. Rolex glanced at my name tag. "I just had the most unprofessional experience of my life," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You might want to reconsider doing business with them." I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was spiraling. This wasn't just some entitled jerk trying to throw his weight around. He was actually trying to get me fired. For the first time in this whole mess, I wasn't sure what move to make. And that's when the door swung open. A man in a navy blue blazer stepped inside. He wasn't flashy like Mr. Rolex, but the way he carried himself, you could feel the authority radiating off him. The shop suddenly felt smaller. Mr. Rolex's smirk grew wider. "Mike," he said, striding forward like they were old friends. "Glad you could make it." But Mike didn't even look at him. Instead, he walked right up to me. "You the one who handled this?" he asked, his tone steady but with an edge of authority. I swallowed, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Yes, sir," I said, keeping my voice calm, "just doing my job." Mike nodded slowly. Then he turned to Mr. Rolex. "What happened?" I braced myself for whatever twisted version of events Mr. Rolex was about to spin. "I tried to place an order," Mr. Rolex said, rolling his eyes, "and this kid decided to give me an attitude. I've been a client of yours for years, and I can't support a business that treats people like this." Mike was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a single question. "You cut the line, didn't you, Mr.?" Rolex froze. "Excuse me?" he said, his confidence slipping. "You cut the line," Mike repeated, his tone sharper now. "Did you or did you not walk past everyone and demand to be served first, Mr.?" Rolex's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He was scrambling. "Look, it's lunch hour. I don't have time to wait behind. That's all I needed to hear, Mike said, cutting him off. He turned back to me. What's your name? He asked. I told him, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I saw something I hadn't expected. Mike smiled. You handled this exactly the way you should have, he said. I appreciate employees who stand by policy, even under pressure. Relief flooded through me so fast that I felt a little dizzy. Mr. Rolex, however, was losing it. You can't be serious, he snapped, his face turning red. You're siding with them after everything I've done for your company? Mike's patience was wearing thin. You know what, Tom? He said, and I swear the name Tom made it even funnier. You're right about one thing. You've been a client for years. Tom's smugness crept back, like he thought he was winning again. Mike's next words wiped it right off his face. Not anymore. Silence. Absolute silence. Mike pulled out his own phone, scrolled for a second, and hit a number. Yeah, he said after a couple of rings. Canceled Tom's contract. Effective immediately. Tom's face went pale. You can't do that. Already done, Mike said, pocketing his phone. Tom looked like he'd just been punched in the gut. You're throwing away years of business over a sandwich shop? Mike tilted his head. No, he said calmly. I'm dropping a problem client who disrespects service workers. And just like that, Tom's world crumbled. Mike turned back to me, giving me a reassuring nod. Keep up the good work, he said. I barely managed to nod before he walked out, leaving Tom standing there, red-faced and humiliated. But something in Tom's eyes told me this wasn't over. Not yet. Tom didn't leave right away. No, that would have been too easy. He stood there, gripping his phone so tight I thought he might crack the screen. His face was still bright red, but now there was something else, anger mixed with pure humiliation. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. This isn't over, he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. I didn't flinch, but my stomach tightened. I've dealt with my fair share of rude customers, people who get snippy when we run out of avocado or freak out because we forgot extra mayo. But this was different. Tom wasn't mad about a sandwich. He was mad because, for the first time in who knows how long, someone had told him no, and he couldn't handle it. Tom forced a tight, thin smile back onto his face. But it was all wrong, too stretched, too forced. You might have won today, he said, leaning in close enough that I could smell the overpriced cologne clinging to his suit. But you're just, he paused, his eyes scanning my uniform, the cheap name tag pinned to my shirt. A nobody, he finished, his voice dripping with disdain. A kid working a dead-end job. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to, because the moment he stepped back, the older woman he had tried to cut in front of earlier, she cleared her throat, loudly. Oh, honey, she said, her tone sweet but laced with sarcasm. You lost the moment you opened your mouth. The chuckles that rippled through the line were quiet, but they hit like a gut punch to Tom's ego. His jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might crack. His eyes darted around the shop, taking in the faces of the customers who had witnessed every second of his downfall. And that's when he did what all people like him do when they lose control. He doubled down. I'll be back, he hissed, pointing a finger at me like he was making some kind of declaration. You think this is funny? I know people. You're gonna regret this. Okay, Tom, I said, deadpan. I didn't give him the satisfaction of looking rattled. See you around. Tom's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say another word. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed out, the little bell above the door jingling a little too cheerfully for the mood he left behind. The second the door slammed shut, the entire shop exhaled at once. Dude, my coworker Ryan muttered from the sandwich station, finally turning around with a grin. What the hell just happened? I shook my head, still processing. Honestly, I don't even know. The older woman, bless her, gave me a reassuring smile. Don't worry about men like that, sweetheart. They're all bark and no bite. Thanks, I murmured, but something in my gut told me that wasn't true. Tom wasn't the kind of guy who let things go, and as much as I wanted to believe he was just blowing off steam, I had a sinking feeling this wasn't the last I'd see of him. The rest of the day went by in a blur. Customers came and went, and eventually, the lunch rush died down. But even after the line was gone and the shop was quiet again, I couldn't shake the feeling that Tom was lurking somewhere in the back of my mind. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted not just physically, but mentally. I clocked out, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door, but as I pushed it open, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I frowned, glancing at the screen. Normally I'd ignore it, but something told me to pick up. Hello? Silence. Then, a voice I hadn't been expecting. Hey, Jake. A familiar, cool voice drawled. Remember me? My stomach dropped. Tom? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Smart kid, he said, and I could hear the smirk in his tone, even over the phone. We need to talk. My grip on the phone tightened. I don't think we have anything to talk about. Oh, but we do, he said smoothly. I've been doing a little digging. Turns out, your little sandwich shop, it's part of a chain. And the corporate office, well, I've got a few friends there. My blood ran cold. See, Tom continued, his tone laced with smug satisfaction. I made a couple of calls. Told them all about what happened today. They didn't sound too happy. I swallowed hard, but I kept my voice steady. And, Tom said, drawing the word out like he was savoring it. Let's just say, I've got a meeting set up with someone who does have the power to make sure you never work at that shop again. My heart pounded, but I refused to let him hear the fear in my voice. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Tom chuckled, and it made my skin crawl. Oh, Jake, he said, his tone almost pitying. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about teaching you a lesson. I clenched my jaw, my mind racing. He was bluffing. He had to be. But what if he wasn't? I'll see you soon, Tom said. And before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, phone still pressed to my ear, my heart pounding like a drum. This was bad. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tom's smug face and heard his voice echoing in my head. By the time morning rolled around, I was running on maybe 2 hours of sleep and way too much anxiety. I dragged myself to work, forcing a smile as I clocked in. But the second I stepped behind the counter, I knew something was off. Ryan was already there, looking way too serious for this early in the morning. Dude, he muttered, his eyes flicking toward the back. Corporate's here. My stomach dropped. Corporate? I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, Ryan nodded, glancing toward the small office in the back. They're talking to Dave. Dave was our manager. Good guy. He had my back more times than I could count. But if corporate was here because of Tom, there was only so much Dave could do. I forced a breath through my nose, squaring my shoulders. Okay, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I'll handle it. Ryan gave me a look, one that said, Are you sure? But I just nodded. The walk to the office felt longer than usual, and when I pushed the door open, I wasn't surprised to see 2 men in suits sitting across from Dave. One of them looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. You must be Jake, he said, standing and extending a hand. Yeah, I said, shaking it. My voice steady even though my insides were a mess. That's me. I'm Mark, he said, his tone professional but not unkind. We've been hearing a lot about you. I swallowed hard. Good things, I hope. Mark's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. That's what we're here to find out. I glanced at Dave, who gave me a subtle nod, his face calm but serious. Why don't you take a seat? Mark said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat, forcing myself to keep my back straight and my expression neutral. Jake, Mark began, his tone calm but direct. We've been made aware of an incident that occurred yesterday. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm guessing Tom told you his version. Mark's expression didn't change. We've heard his side, yes, but we want to hear yours. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't let it show. I took a deep breath and started from the beginning every detail. From Tom cutting the line to the job application, all the way to him trying to call in favors to get me fired. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I just told the truth. By the time I finished, Mark was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed and expression thoughtful. Well, he said after a moment, that's quite a story. It's the truth, I said, meeting his gaze head on. Mark nodded, then exchanged a glance with the other suit, who hadn't said a word yet. We'll be in touch, Mark finally said, standing and offering his hand again. I shook it, my grip firm even though my nerves were shot. Thanks for your time, Jake, he said. As they left, Dave gave me a small, reassuring smile, but I wasn't ready to relax just yet, because something told me Tom wasn't done. The next couple of days crawled by. Every shift felt like walking on eggshells. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Tom wasn't the type to just back off. Guys like him, they didn't take losses gracefully. No, they plotted, they schemed, and I had no doubt that somewhere Tom was licking his wounds and figuring out his next move. But nothing happened. No calls, no emails, no weird visits from corporate, just silence. And honestly, that was almost worse. By the time Friday rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. I hadn't told anyone, but I'd been updating my resume, just in case. I loved my job, but I wasn't about to sit around waiting for Tom to pull the rug out from under me. Still, when I walked into the shop that morning, everything felt normal. The usual buzz of customers, the smell of fresh bread, and Ryan, as always, goofing off behind the sandwich station. "Dude," he called out when he saw me. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Feels like it," I muttered, clocking in. "Anything weird happen?" He shrugged. "Nope, just the usual. No Tom, no drama." I exhaled, letting out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was over. I should have known better. It happened right after the lunch rush. The shop had finally calmed down. I was wiping down the counter when I saw him walk in. Tom, but he wasn't alone. Two other men followed him, one of them tall and broad, the other shorter but just as intimidating. They looked official, like the kind of guys who carried briefcases filled with legal documents that ruined your life. My stomach dropped. Tom's smile was back, that smug grin that made my skin crawl. And this time, he wasn't trying to hide it. "Jake," he drawled, his voice echoing through the quiet shop. "Miss me?" I kept my face neutral, but my heart was pounding. "What do you want, Tom?" I asked, my tone calm but firm. Tom gestured toward the men with him. "Meet my attorneys," he said, his grin widening. "We need to have a little chat." I glanced toward the back, hoping Dave was around, but he was on break. It was just me and Ryan looked as freaked out as I felt. "What's this about?" I asked, crossing my arms to keep them from shaking. Tom's smile turned predatory. "Oh, nothing too serious," he said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "Just a little wrongful termination suit." My brain screeched to a halt. "Wrongful termination?" I echoed, blinking. "You don't even work here." Tom's grin didn't falter. "No," he said smoothly, but I applied. "Remember?" My stomach dropped. The job application, the one I'd handed him in front of everyone. "You gave me an application," Tom continued, his tone as smug as ever, and I filled it out. Didn't hear back. "That's discrimination, Jake." I blinked, genuinely speechless for a second. "You're suing us?" "Technically," one of the lawyers chimed in, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Davidson is claiming that he was unfairly denied employment due to personal bias and public humiliation." My brain couldn't keep up. This was insane. "Are you serious?" I asked, looking at Tom like he'd lost his mind. "Dead serious," Tom replied, his grin never wavering. "You embarrassed me, made me look like a fool. Now, I'm gonna make sure this place pays for it." My mouth went dry. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Tom was trying to burn the whole shop to the ground. But before I could even process what was happening, the door chimed again, and that's when things got interesting. Mike walked in. Not just Mike. Mike, the guy who had canceled Tom's insurance contract. And this time, he wasn't alone either. A woman followed him, her heels clicking against the floor with purpose. She was in her mid-40s, sharp eyes, sleek hair, and the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Jake," Mike said, his tone calm but carrying a weight that filled the entire shop. "Everything okay?" Tom's smirk faltered for the first time. "What the hell are you doing here?" he asked, his confidence slipping. Mike didn't even glance at him. Instead, he looked straight at me. "I got a call," he said simply. "Figured I should come down and see how things were going." Tom's face went pale. "You what?" "And this," Mike gestured to the woman beside him, "is Claire, legal counsel for the parent company that owns this little sandwich shop." Claire stepped forward, her gaze landing squarely on Tom and his so-called lawyers. "Mr. Davidson, is it?" she asked, her tone cool but polite. Tom straightened, trying to regain some of his composure. "That's right," he said, his confidence inching back. "We were just discussing, actually," Claire interrupted, pulling a thick manila folder from her bag. "We were just about to discuss something very different." She placed the folder on the counter, flipping it open with practiced ease. "Mr. Davidson," she said, her tone all business, "do you recall signing a non-compete clause with your former employer?" Tom blinked, caught off guard. What?" Claire's smile was sharp. "The insurance firm you were working with," she said smoothly. "The one that had a standing contract with this establishment?" Tom's face drained of color. "See," Claire continued, her tone polite but lethal, "when you tried to interfere with this business, You violated that clause. And since you made such a public spectacle of it, she trailed off, letting the weight of her words settle. Tom's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Long story short, Claire said, snapping the folder shut with a crisp thwap. If you move forward with this frivolous lawsuit, you're looking at a countersuit that'll make your head spin. We're talking breach of contract, interference with business operations, and let's not forget, defamation. Tom's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Still want to play this game, Tom? Mike asked, his tone dripping with amusement. Tom's eyes darted between Claire, Mike, and his lawyers. His confidence gone. His arrogance completely deflated. Maybe. One of his lawyers murmured, clearing his throat, "We should reconsider, Mr. Davidson." Tom looked like he was going to explode, but he wasn't stupid. Not anymore. He saw the writing on the wall. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out, his lawyers scrambling to follow. The door slammed behind them. Silence, and then applause. The customers, all of them, broke into applause. Someone even whistled. I blinked, a little stunned, but when I glanced at Mike and Claire, they both just smiled. "Nice work, Jake," Mike said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Thanks," I murmured, still trying to process everything. Claire gave me a nod. "You handled yourself well. If you ever decide you want a job that's a little more exciting than sandwiches, give me a call." I chuckled, feeling the weight that had been pressing on me finally lift. "Thanks," I said, and for the first time in days, I meant it. Tom didn't come back after that. The lawsuit? Gone. His contract with the insurance company? Terminated. As for me, life went back to normal, but something had changed. I wasn't just the kid behind the counter anymore. I was the guy who had stood his ground, who hadn't let some entitled jerk walk all over him. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat, because that day, Tom learned a lesson that money can't buy. And me, I learned that sometimes standing up for yourself feels better than any paycheck ever could.